Mr. Howard, Sir Peter, Ambassador Guterres, ladies and gents, it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to all the speakers today. I played a small part in the East Timor operation, looking after number 1 squadron and the F-111s, but I've heard a lot more today that provided context that I really wasn't aware of at the time. I think, while it wasn't as obvious to the general public, the RAF certainly contributed greatly to the success of INTERFET, and I think Sir Peter mentioned that it really came across as very much a sort of a land campaign, and then people realised, yes, they were using aeroplanes for evacuation, but probably that's about it. One thing that did come out immediately after East Timor was the ANAO did a report on operations in East Timor and the performance of the Army, Navy and Air Force. And I'm very pleased to say that they thought that the Australian Defence Force and the Air Force had performed very well and reflected great credit on the quality of training, equipment and preparation. I tend to agree with some of the commentators today that perhaps it wasn't so much good performance due to preparation, but more good performance due to the quality of people that we actually had on the ground and the way that they adapted to a situation and made do. The RAF learnt a lot from INTERFET, and over the past 20 years we've certainly applied those lessons, and at the risk of appearing as though I'm incredibly pro-Air Force and trying to sing their praises, the Royal Australian Air Force today has been referred to a couple of times around the globe as the best little Air Force in the world, and I think a lot of that is to do with implementing the lessons that we got out of East Timor. I'll certainly discuss the changes to the RAF and be as brief as I can, because I realise I've only got maybe 10 or 12 minutes. But what I wouldn't mind doing is just mentioning a little bit about what the RAAF did in East Timor. Of course, we've heard about going in from July of 1999. We heard from the Australian Federal Police about the fact that we delivered the teams into Timor. We obviously had people that caught some of our rides out of East Timor back to Darwin as well in the evacuations. I think less well known is the fact that we had a lot of support staff on the ground. Just prior to East Timor, we had Combat Support Group formed, and so we had our Expeditionary Combat Support Squadrons up in East Timor doing a sterling job. And what I'd like to say is that the stats speak for themselves. Over the period of INTERFET and the ensuing operations, there were 17,000 flights that they looked after, 200,000 passengers and 3.2 million kilograms of cargo. Pretty impressive. Also, the RAF didn't do it alone. We, of course, were supported by other air transport assets from around the globe and other capabilities. We also had Caribous on the ground. We heard about that. Less well known, P3 maritime patrol aircraft around East Timor patrolling, working with the Navy, and of course we had the F-111 aircraft to do photographic and PAVTAC reconnaissance. Despite the media reports to the contrary, I can confirm that there were no interactions between INTERFET and Indonesian TNI aircraft in 1999. It definitely was a relatively benign air operation. Just on the lessons learned, I'd like to start with force structure, and I know David Kilcullen spoke about that at some length. I'd like to take a slightly different perspective. The East Timor campaign came at the end of a decade of cuts. We had been reducing the military through firstly the force structure review and then through other reviews, and the Air Force in particular went from 22,000 down to 15,000 just prior to the East Timor operation kicking off. The Defence Reform Program, something that arose out of the Defence Efficiency Review of 1995, wanted to reduce the Australian Defence Force to just over 42,000 people total. And that would have had an Air Force of about 8,000 to 10,000 uniformed people. And the idea behind that was that it would fund improved capability. However, the Defence Reform Program was still being introduced and implemented in 1999 as East Timor kicked off. And as a result, the partly because of the operation and because of decisions that were later made, the ADF was maintained at about 50,000 personnel and the RAF at about 14,000 to 15,000 personnel. So while ultimately the RAF did deliver during East Timor, it was probably despite rather than because of the recent reviews that had gone on in that previous decade. Also, we didn't have the US in a leading role in INTERFET, as we heard. We were in that seat, and because of the absence of the US, we didn't actually have access to the same level of enablers that we previously have had. No electronic warfare aircraft, no airborne early warning aircraft, limited intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, and only a training air-to-air refuelling capability should we need to use it. So what was the impact for us? The INTERFET operations were able to be used by the Chief of the Air Force at the time, Air Marshal Errol McCormack, to refute some of the more extreme force structure proposals then being proposed, and they were as low as something like 4,000 to 8,000 people. We also, since 1990, have been able to project and support air power in a Timor-like operation, as in the ability to project into the region. We've demonstrated that on several occasions and around the globe, and that's become an accepted way of determining what force is appropriate for us to develop to. We've maintained our force of about 15,000 people, and also we've procured many key capabilities that previously were only in the inventory of our larger allied nations, allies, including Wedgetail, including the KC-30 air refuelling aircraft and the Growler electronic warfare, and also we're about to embark on procuring larger uninhabited air vehicles. I think the success of ADF operations in East Timor led to the increased use of the ADF in ensuing operations, and within 4 years of INTERFET, the RAF was conducting air combat operations in the Middle East. And that was the first time that they'd been dropping bombs in anger since Vietnam, 30 years previously. So certainly it made quite a difference to the way that we force structured. Secondly, the lesson that we learned, as well as one that I know David brought out as well with, is logistics and sustainment. In the period up to 1999, the Air Force logistics related personnel alone went from 4,000 personnel down to 2,000, and it was unsurprising that there were critical shortages of the RAF logistics staff during INTERFET, including things like air terminal operators, basic people that you need to run an airfield. This was compounded by inadequate involvement of logistics staff in the planning stage, and as I mentioned before, Combat Support Group was one of those areas that did very well in East Timor, proved its worth. It was quite nascent at the time, but since then it is the largest group in the Air Force now. It's able to deploy and support air operations around the globe and in the region, and it's demonstrated that very well in the Middle East and in other locations. The other aspect was that the RAF C-130 fleet was almost fully employed just doing the basic operations of evacuating refugees and providing forces into East Timor. So there was no spare capacity there. So a couple of people mentioned the idea that imagine if the outcome had been a different future. Imagine if there had been significant combat operations and we had to plus up rather quickly. We certainly didn't have the airlift capacity to do that rapidly. And so since INTERFET, the RAF has focused on that heavy lift capability and has a large fleet of C-17 aircraft. We have the KC-30, which combines air refuelling with transport, and also we've got the battlefield airlifter in the C-27J. So some great capabilities there. The timely dissemination of information in INTERFET was a real problem. And that is that we obviously did not have anywhere near the ability to move information around the battlefield and between locations in Australia and overseas that we have now and are going to get in the future. In 1991, they used the term data deluge. They got so much information through their systems and they just couldn't transmit it out to the warfighters. The ADF and the RAF learned that again in 1999. And I'd like to just, as an example, this is imagery from an RF-111 up on the screen. I flew on those on ops there, and when we landed, we didn't have the ability to transmit that electronically. It was digitised information, and we couldn't transmit it electronically from RAF Base Tyndall to either Darwin or to East Timor, anywhere. And so we had to come up with a very cunning plan of taking the digitised imagery, printing it down, getting a staff car, which was a rental car from the local agency, and one of our airmen would drive it up to Darwin and would hand it to a person who was jumping on a C-130. They would hand it to a person at the other end, and eventually they would then put it in a vehicle and take it out to whoever requested it. An incredibly inefficient way of doing it, and quite obviously we have advanced significantly since then.
Praise be.
Yeah. So the lesson we've learned, of course, is that you don't just go and buy intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance platforms such as the Triton and other capabilities and the Wedgetail. You make sure you have the ground segments sorted out. You make sure you have those IT bearers, the ability to move that information around on the ground. And that is something which the RAAF has put and the ADF has put great emphasis on. The RAF and the ADF learned a lot about operational planning from the INTERFET experience. INTERFET was the first time that the Australian military and relevant government agencies had really participated in operational and strategic planning since Vietnam. And of course there was a bit of friction, and there was a little bit of unfamiliarity with the way that it was to be done. There was also a tendency to, because of some security leaks that occurred early in 1999, there was a tendency to compartmentalise the information. And for example, I only learned about the likelihood of my unit deploying perhaps a matter of 2 weeks before we actually deployed in late 1999. So interesting that that compartmentalisation resulted in challenges to the operational planning. So what have we learned about that? Well, we've now got an Air Operations Centre embedded in the Joint Operations Command, in the headquarters. It enables experts at the most senior level, so we have a DG Air and a 1-star, all the way down, those experts to interact with the Joint Operations Planning staff, and also to provide a conduit by which information can be spread back to the air operational commanders in the field. I think I was very interested when Sir Peter mentioned command and control and the challenges that were presented. I very much saw those even from my level. Just prior to INTERFET, in July of 1999, the responsibility for operations was taken away from VCDF, and that left COMAST as the 2-star officer performing that role. So we ended up with a situation where COMAST dealt with 2-star officers in the environment, in the environmental commands, in the services, dealing with, of course, a 2-star commander in the field. So the air command and control arrangements were fairly complicated, but even further complicated by both the Air Force and the subordinate air headquarters and Headquarters Australian Theatre, in some cases simultaneously tasking air units and doing it via interesting means such as telephones and other means. And so you really needed to meet fairly regularly to have an idea of who had tasked who to do what. That was obviously a complexity that has since been fixed, I guess, through having a single embedded air operations centre. So back at the time of Timor, we had air operations staff in air headquarters who weren't really driving the fight. We didn't have any air operations experts in Headquarters Australian Theatre, and we had a few in Darwin, assisting Commander INTERFET. So we ended up having 3 areas that thought that they could control it, but none of them really had that centre of gravity of staff to do it. We now have that centre of gravity in that Air Operations Centre at JOC. And certainly it's now evolved to the point where on activities like relics, we can flip a P3 crew or a P8 crew that is doing normal air training for the Air Force. Instantly they can be flipped over to doing an actual operation under JOC, force assigned, and then flipped back before they land. I mean, it's now become quite slick the way that we're able to manage that, and it's very clear when they're force assigned who they respond to, who is in command. So that's been a great movement forward. I think defence industry, very early on we had Michael Ward talk about the importance of industry. Every word he said was absolutely correct, and I think if I had to characterise it at the time of INTERFET, we had entered into a lot of commercial contracts that were based around the idea of us deploying long distances before we use our forces, and that in garrison and operations from Australia would always be peacetime operations. And we hadn't quite thought about the contractual implications of actually fighting from Australia or operating from Australia in support of regional operations where we were the lead. Since East Timor, we've become much smarter at the way that we do those contractual arrangements, and we do have the ability to plus up in our contracts. And in particular, we've invested much more heavily in industry supporting training and managing our home capabilities, our training capabilities while we deploy. So, for instance, the F-35, all of the aircrew training, apart from actually flying in the aeroplanes and instructor flying alongside new pilots, everything else is commercial. And so if they deploy, the training operation is not affected by losing those people. So in conclusion, I think it's clear that the lessons from INTERFET have definitely shaped the Air Force of today, and they continue to shape the way that we approach force structure, command and control, and in many other areas. They certainly, INTERFET reset, after a decade of reductions, INTERFET reset that benchmark for what the government expected of the ADF and what we needed to force structure around. And that was a useful reminder, I think, to all of us there. It also resulted in air command and control being fully integrated into joint command and control. And I think we have ended up with an incredibly good system today. Obviously it will evolve in the future, but certainly we've ended up with a very, very workable command and control system for our joint operations today. The RAF built an impressive air operations support capability with Combat Support Group and continues to expand that operation. Supporting air operations, establishing an airfield, having air traffic control, having fire services, doing that in an area that has been destroyed through war and through insurgent operations is absolutely critical to us, and they do it very well. And in doing so, we have leveraged defence industry to achieve that. We're also no longer really reliant on the US solely for our key enablers. So intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, airborne early warning, air refuelling, heavy airlift, all of those capabilities, we at least have the ability to independently operate in our region with those capabilities. So certainly, final comment is INTERFET has had a very significant and lasting effect on the RAF, and I think it was absolutely a positive influence that it's had over the past 2 decades. Thank you.
So just one question for you, Cos, if I could. We've heard from Commodore Stapleton about the taking up of ships from trade for military use. Was there a need, and has there been thought to how, back in those days, it would have been Ansett and Qantas? but how domestic carriers may then, in short term, be used to make up some of those lower end capabilities. And was East Timor a part of that consideration?
Absolutely, a great question. And just if I use the US as an example, the US actually has legislation that pays a premium to airlines when they buy their aeroplanes to make sure that they are stressed so that they can be used for military cargo. And so they obviously have they're intending to use commercial aeroplanes to back up that strategic airlift capability. We obviously used airlines to provide capability into Vietnam. We've had a long history of doing it. We used Qantas to fly across to Ceylon during World War II in Catalinas to keep the communications with the UK open. So the bottom line is, yes, it is thought about, and we have a number of contracts with people like Omega air refuelling tankers and others, and transport aeroplanes. We use transport aeroplanes for strategic airlift into the Middle East, and we continue to use commercial providers for some of our training as well. But I think, in a nutshell, I think in the future we're going to see an even increasing amount of usage of the commercial providers there to support us.
So if everything had gone really badly on the ground in September of 1999, could you have picked up the phone and said to Qantas, we need help to remove people because we don't have military capacity to do it?
You could have picked up the telephone and spoken to Qantas. I don't know what the answer would have been. If I was a Qantas pilot, I would have said, sorry, wrong number.
Sometimes I'm left speechless. It was a terrific presentation. I think opened up for us many things about the Air Force and change that we didn't know. Would you please thank Kim this afternoon?